Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this Co-ops 101 masterclass. My name is Madeline Reed, and I am the Education Manager at the British Columbia Cooperative Association. We're so grateful to have been invited by the Women's Economic Council to collaborate on this training in support of the 50/30 Challenge. And I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today about the foundation of cooperatives. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which I'm currently located, and also, as I do so, invite you to acknowledge to yourself the lands where you may be located at this time. I myself am on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, or what is colonially known as Vancouver, BC, Canada, and want to express my gratitude to these nations and the peoples of these nations who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. I myself am a descendant of European settlers, and I'm currently sitting in the home that I grew up in Vancouver. And so, as someone who has lived here on these lands and who is of this particular lineage, I want to simultaneously express the immense gratitude I have for having the privilege of growing up in this place, and also the responsibility I have as a settler to work towards the right relations between the land and also with the land and the people who have been here for thousands of years. Before we jump into the presentation today, the official Co-ops 101, I just want to give some context about the British Columbia Cooperative Association, or what we often call BCCA for short, and just share about who we are and what we do. We refer to ourselves as BC's Cooperative Knowledge and Resource Center, and our work focuses on supporting cooperatives and the cooperative movement across our province. And we do this in the following ways. One of them is cooperative education, which is why I'm here today getting to talk to you about cooperatives. And you'll learn a bit more about why that's really important through the presentation. The second is cooperative development. And so that's supporting both new cooperatives and emerging cooperatives with getting together, getting incorporated, getting their enterprises off the ground, and also with supporting the longevity of existing cooperatives. So that can be support services like legal support, accounting, different types of consulting services, really whatever it is that co-ops might need to be able to keep doing the good work that they're doing. We also do a lot of advocacy and lobbying to the provincial government. You'll notice around the world in the most sort of cooperative rich economies in different places, often they are able to be very successful because of a lot of legislative government support that really helps cooperatives thrive. So we're really trying to push for that in our province as well. And finally, we act as a sort of coordinator of the ecosystem across the province, providing opportunities for networking, connection, and collaboration for co-ops across BC. All right, without further ado, let's jump into it. I'm going to move my mouse in case you can see that. What is a cooperative? Maybe sounds like a basic question. We're going to run through the basics right now. So, by definition, a cooperative is a voluntary association of members that come together to serve or address some kind of common need. They might be organizations or individuals. You could have a cooperative of organizations or cooperatives of individual people. And really, the point is whoever it is, they're coming together because they are trying to address some need that might be really challenging or perhaps even impossible to achieve on their own individually. And in coming together, all members purchase a share in the organization, meaning that the members are all co owners of this cooperative. And in doing so, they create a shared pool of capital that the cooperative can then use to address their shared need, whether that's purchasing assets, hiring staff to run the cooperative, any sorts of things like that. And yes, so by they're co-owners by creating this shared pool of capital, everything is owned in common by the membership, which is pretty cool. Another thing about the way that they come together in a cooperative that's very unique is that all members get an equal vote in electing the board of directors. And I really bolded equal vote here to highlight this aspect of cooperatives that's quite unique compared to other types of organizational models. It doesn't matter how much each person or organization has invested in the cooperative. If you are a member, you get one vote just like everyone else. And The members vote to elect a board of directors, and the board's job is really to make sure the key decisions to ensure that the cooperative achieves its goals. So, they're the ones who would decide whether they're going to spend the money to hire staff, to carry out the operations, to purchase those types of assets, or supplies that are needed for the co-op to operate and serve its community. Final piece I'll say on this is that if a co-op makes a surplus or a profit, often we hear the word surplus in the co-op community because profit can feel a little um, the word feels very capitalist driven, so it can feel a little misaligned with the mission of a cooperative, but sort of the same thing. It's the money that's left over. So if the co-op makes a surplus, the members get to decide where that money goes. And this kind of can go two different ways. The first is patronage returns, and so that's the cooperative equivalent of dividends. So what that looks like is at the end of the year, uh, members will receive money back from the cooperative based on how much they used the cooperative. So unlike in sort of a shareholder situation where you get money back based on how much you've invested, in a co-op, let's say you have a grocery store. If you are someone who shopped at the co-op once a week, you bought all your groceries there for the whole year, you will get a bigger patronage return than someone who maybe shops at the co-op only once every few months and just grabs a couple things. The other way that surplus might be invested or used is reinvestment into the cooperative. So this could be, to hire more staff, to grow the cooperative, to secure the enterprise so that it can keep doing the good work or expand on the good work it does for its community. And the board might do a combination of these things. They might pick one or the other. Really, the way that you decide on what you do is you think about what is going to serve the membership best. So the co-op is really there to serve its members. And so if redistributing wealth back into the community through patronage returns is what's going to serve your membership best, then maybe that's the route you choose. Or, if making sure the co-op is stable and secure so it can keep doing its good work is what's most important, then maybe that's the decision you make. So that was kind of a quick overview of how cooperatives work. And now, just to really solidify what that actually looks like in practice, we're gonna think about what's the difference here. What really makes the difference between a cooperative and a for-profit company or perhaps a not-for-profit society. I really intentionally here am using the terms company and society because, as we'll learn, a cooperative can be for-profit or not-for-profit. And so, right here, we're really distinguishing between the sort of we're distinguishing between the structures here as opposed to the sort of financial management, but we will talk about that a little bit. To kick us off, let's start with looking at the company structure. So in a company, at the very top, we have the shareholders, who are the people who govern, or the people who own the company, rather. And some subset of those are directors, and those are the governors of the company, the ones who make the decisions. And the directors, important to highlight here, are chosen based on how much someone has invested in the company. So if you are some of the top, you have the biggest financial stake in the company, you get to have the most say. So that's how those directors are chosen. And then sort of separate, no, it's not sure. There we go. Sort of separate from the shareholders and directors, the actual owners of the company, we have the actual operations, and this includes the president or CEO who's making the sort of the leadership decisions, and they hire staff and management to help them carry out those operations. And then again, sort of separate from that, we have the customers, and you'll see some two-directional arrows here. So the customers with the downward arrow are purchasing some kind of good or service from the company, and in turn, generating revenue back into the company. And then at the end of the year, we come to this piece we mentioned just a few moments ago about dividends. And so if the company makes a profit, the shares or the money gets distributed in dividends back to the shareholders. And again, it's distributed based on how much folks have invested into the company. Next, let's look at the society, which is always a not-for-profit structure. But again, we're focusing on structure as opposed to finances at this moment. And we'll think of the society as this nice little box here, arbitrary shape. And within the society, there are members, like in a cooperative. But I have a dotted line around the members here to sort of illustrate the less defined nature of a member in a society versus a cooperative. In a society, you often members are folks who want to volunteer their time, want to participate in supporting a really good cause in their community. They're not necessarily the people who are actually using the services of the society. For example, you might have a not-for-profit society that provides, maybe the food bank, for example, provides food to folks in need who can't afford to purchase food from grocery stores all the time. And the people who are members are people who might be anyone in the community who thinks the food bank is a good cause. They might not necessarily use its services. So that's just an important distinction to make there. Whereas in a cooperative, it's the folks who are really the members who are using the cooperative. So we have that distinction here. But same. Members become members because they want to support a cause and potentially vote for or run to be on the board of directors. And that's the key governing body in this scenario as well. And again, sort of like we've seen before, the board hires some kind of executive, in this case, an executive director, who then hires staff to carry out the operations of the organization. In a society context, we have money coming from external sources most of the time. So that's donations, potentially it's philanthropists, it could be government grants, this type of thing. And because it's a non-for-profit, all of that money gets translated into the services provided to provide that service to whatever community that the society is aiming to serve. And at the end, as we just said, it's a not-for-profit, so there is no profit at the end. And now let's return back to the cooperative model again, and let's start again with that circle of membership that we had at the very beginning with all those dots in a circle. So, and in doing this, what I want to say is, in doing this, we'll see how by sort of being the container of the cooperative, members are also the foundation, they're also the core of the cooperative and all of its operations. So we have this circle of members who've come together, they pay their share, they join the cooperative, and again, we have an election for a board of directors. And here again, the board is really elected from the membership, from the people who are using the cooperative to access whatever it is that they're hoping to access in this collective. We have the board. Same script as we've seen before. The board hires some kind of executive, either an executive director or CEO, depending on what type of organization it is. They hire management, they hire staff, and the staff or the cooperative delivers some kind of good or service to its membership. So we see here, we started with the members at the top and we've ended up back at the members at the end as well. And this works in the reverse order too. So we have staff report back to management, back to the executive, and back to the board. And then the board is responsible for reporting back out to the members for that accountability and transparency piece. So we see here, members are absolutely integral to how the cooperative functions, to what the cooperative does, how it decides to serve its membership. And this makes it a very unique model. Something I will say here that will make more sense in a little bit, perhaps, but is important to note is that you can have cooperatives where the members are in fact the staff, a worker-owned cooperative. And so this diagram doesn't totally work for that scenario, but we'll talk about how that model works anyway. So just to keep that in mind. And so if we want to summarize some key differences here between these three organizational structures, the company, society, and cooperative, let's summarize some key points here just to really hone in on what the difference is. If we think about ownership, who owns these organizations? In the case of a company, we have it's the shareholders who own it. In the case of a society, it's not owned by anyone. It's sort of its own entity. And in the case of a cooperative, it's the members who really own it. When we think about control, who is able to make the key decisions that infect these organizations? Affect, not infect. In the case of the company, we have the control is based on investment. So the more you've invested, the more control you have over the company. In the case of a society and a cooperative, we have this one member, one vote system, this equal voting. You know, if you're a member, you get one vote just like everyone else. But it's important here that we remember that distinction in membership. In a society, the members are not necessarily the ones who are taking advantage of the services provided by the cooperative. And in the case of a cooperative, if you are a member, you are actively engaged in in that in that relationship of receiving services, accessing services, purchasing particular goods. So that's an important distinction to make. I know we said we weren't really going to talk about money, but let's think about it here for a second. And I think I love talking about this piece because for me, this is the piece that really highlighted to me what makes the difference between a cooperative and just some kind of social impact organization. So if you think about wealth distribution, it's quite different in each scenario. In a company, the money goes back to the shareholders, as we talked about, based on investment. And what this means is this can be a very extractive model. Even if the company is doing really good work, what happens is then at the end of the year, the money that was generated by a particular community is then sent potentially all over the world to people who have invested. So that money that was generated one place suddenly gets extracted and sent elsewhere. In the case of a society, there is no wealth distribution because there is no profit. In the case of a cooperative, again, it's back to the membership. So, and co-ops are often, not always, but often very geographically specific. And so this can be a really great tool for supporting community economic development and growth because co-ops are really good at circulating wealth within communities. And oh, what was the last piece I was going to say? No matter. That's really the key point there, is that they circulate wealth back to the membership. And finally, if we think about the overall purpose of each of these organizations, in the case of a company, it's to create a return on investment. In the case of a society, it's to serve the community or to serve, a community. And in the case of a cooperative, it's to serve its members. So hopefully that gives a bit of a clearer picture on really what makes the difference when we're talking about cooperatives versus other organizations. Another piece that makes co-ops really unique in addition to its structure is that all co-ops around the world, of which there are many, in fact, over 3 million cooperatives around the world, all of them share the same values and principles, no matter where they are, which is pretty amazing. So the International Cooperative Alliance, which is sort of the global organization representing cooperatives around the world, they have a set of cooperative values and principles that essentially, when you incorporate as a cooperative, no matter where you are, you're agreeing to uphold and adhere to these values and principles. Starting with the cooperative values, there are 6. These are values that include self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equity, equality, and solidarity. There are actually a couple others, ethical values that are included on the website as well that include honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others. So very much about communities having autonomy, lifting themselves up, about sharing power, sharing wealth, and about transparency and support and collective support. And so these values all really inform the 7 cooperative principles, which if you've heard about cooperatives before, you've probably heard about the principles because people love to talk about them. They are pretty unique and interesting. And it's cool that this, co-ops are the only model, business organizational model that has these internationally agreed upon principles. And so I'll just go through each of them really briefly, just to kind of give some understanding of what they are. In the first one, oh, also they're numbered mostly for the sake of ease of reference. This is not a hierarchy. Often that gets conflated. They're just 7 principles. Maybe it would be better to represent them in a circle as opposed to a top-down list with numbers, but just keep that in mind. They're all 7 are equally as important. They just happen to be in an order for memory and reference. And so we have number 1, which is voluntary and open membership. And this is the idea that people can join the co-op of their own will without discrimination based on their lived experiences or identity. I think it's really important here to note that we have open membership. You can't discriminate against people and not let them join if they could benefit from the co-op and could accept the responsibility that comes with membership. But it should be voluntary. No one should be forced to be in a cooperative. And this piece is key sort of in the history of colonialism around the world. It's a part of Canada's colonial history where colonial governments have tried to force Indigenous populations into cooperatives to sort of, force those communities to participate in the colonial economy and society in the way that the government decided was best. And obviously, that's incredibly unjust. And so, part of this principle is it should be voluntary and also open. Number two is this democratic member control. So, again, this idea of one member, one vote, an equal vote. Members set the policy and they make the decisions democratically. Number three is member economic participation. And so this is the idea that the people, the membership, decide where the money goes. They contribute the capital and they also are in charge of and in control of how that's distributed and allocated. Number four is autonomy and independence. And so this means that members decide how the co-op operates and they choose to follow the principles without outside influence. They are really their own autonomous organization. Number five is that education, training, and information. This is why I get to have this job. As you can imagine, when co-ops are when members play such an integral role in cooperation, it's so important that co-ops invest in educating their members so that members can actually be empowered to meaningfully participate in their cooperative. Number six is cooperation among cooperatives. And this is the idea that co-ops are, better served if we are working together in collaboration. Why should cooperation just be isolated to our own cooperatives when it could be expansive to all of our communities? And that we should use our cooperative advantage to uplift each other. And finally, the last one, number seven, but not necessarily the last, just last in this order, is concern for community. So co-ops stand in solidarity with one another, and we really aim to put the people and planet first. Next, I just want to take a moment to talk about where this idea came from. And the point I really want to drive home often is that cooperation is not new. It's something that humans have done since the dawn of time. It's something that is found across species. Charles Darwin's book, The Theory of Evolution, capitalists love to focus on the competition aspect, but 50% of the book was competition. The other 50% was cooperation. It's absolutely integral to survival. And often when cooperative history is discussed, it really takes a Eurocentric focus. And so we have tried really hard to expand that cooperative history because it is incredibly expansive. It's a global movement that's been going on for millennia. And so this is just a history to sort of talk about how it became formalized into the model that we know today in this current economic system that we all participate in. And so to kick that off, before the Common Era, there were ancient civilizations and indigenous communities around the world practicing cooperation. There's evidence of sort of organizations that resemble credit unions in ancient China, burial benefit societies in ancient Greece, farming cooperatives in the Babylonian Empire, where folks would share their yields with the community. And indigenous communities around the world have been practicing a lot of, many values of reciprocity, of community care, relationship to the land, you know, equitable distribution for millennia. So it's really not a new idea. It's something that's been going on in formal and informal ways for many, many years. But something also interesting to note is that trade unions started to emerge in the Middle Ages. So we have a collective organizing in the workplace that's beginning to happen in response to, as we have heard about the European Middle Ages, just horrendous conditions of work and low life expectancy. So some level of trying to make that place better for people at that time. And then this is the piece that people often focus on, which is the cooperative model is formalized in Europe in 1844 in Rochdale, England. And the reason people really fixate on this date, which I think is fair in some ways, is that it's the moment when the first iteration of cooperative principles were written out and used by a cooperative. And so a lot of the principles we use today actually came from this moment, from the incorporation of the Rochdale Society. But it's also important to note that this is kind of the height of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And so it totally makes sense that at this moment in time, the cooperative model has been formalized into what we know it as today, because this is when we sort of enter into this modern industrial era. where there's great hierarchies in the workplace. Many, all the means of production are owned by a very small number of people. And so even though cooperation has been going on for a long time, um, it makes sense to have been formalized into this economic model at this time, because this is the sort of economy that we are facing today, is this, um, you know, uh, small number of people at the top holding a lot of the control and a lot of the capital. And you'll often find throughout history, cooperation emerges when it's really hard to make ends meet as an individual. And so it makes sense that this happened at this time. And cooperation, is formalized in England here, but then it's also formal. It spreads to Germany, to France. There's a huge cooperative movement in Japan that starts to arise, as well as in China, across many different countries. And one that often also gets overlooked is actually the Black communities in the United States who were really reliant on cooperation during the Reconstruction era after the abolition of slavery. And because slavery was criminalized. However, Black communities were still facing a lot of oppression, a lot of danger, the inability to purchase land, to participate in the formal economy. And so they had to cooperate to be able to purchase land, to be able to access enough means to be able to survive. And in fact, Jessica Gordon Nemhard, she's there in the additional resources provided here, so you can go take a look at her work after. She's done a lot of writing about this, and something she highlights is it was even often it's not talked about because it was actually threatening, like life threatening, to publicize the work that these communities were doing, because if they'd been found out, they would have been persecuted for it. And so it hasn't been well reported on, partially of preservation of the community, but it's a very important. And just because it was informal cooperation doesn't mean it isn't a huge part of our history. And finally, just to bring it into our semi-local context, in about the 1900s is when co-ops start to spread across Canada, primarily through settler-owned agriculture cooperatives and dairy cooperatives, as well as some fishing cooperatives in the Maritimes. So we have primarily farming cooperatives taking us from east to west, and cooperation really starting to sort of take form on the West Coast in like the 1920s. But it's sort of happening from this like late 1800s to mid 1900s movement across the country. But of course, Indigenous communities have been here since time immemorial. So that's been going on for a long time in the non-formal context. All right, now that we've talked about what a co-op is, we've sort of compared it to other organizational models, and looked at the history, I really want us to get an opportunity to actually think about, how does this work in practice? What types of structures are there? Something that's amazing about the cooperative model is it's very adaptable. So there are a lot of different structures. I think it's also important to highlight that as we jump into this, it's not absolutely essential that you really are able to categorize every co-op as, structure A, B, or C, but just understand that there's lots of different forms it can take based on who the members are and the needs that they're trying to serve. So let's start with the worker cooperative, which I mentioned earlier on. Perhaps intuitively, the worker co-op is owned by the workers of a company. And the example we have here is the International Women's Catering Co-op, which is located in Victoria, British Columbia. And the members are women cooks and caterers from immigrant backgrounds of many kinds. I can't remember the number exactly, but there's a very impressive number of different languages that this co-op speaks and is able to work together within. So very cool. And the need they had was they wanted stable, well-paying, and culturally appropriate, flexible work with access to benefits. And so they were able to do this by joining together to form a catering business that they all collectively own and are able to serve the foods from their own cultures. And they are able to share contracts, share a market booth, shared a lot of different costs, a kitchen, these types of things that would have been really expensive to afford as a one person or a sole proprietorship. Next, we have a producer co-op, which is also often referred to as a marketing co-op. And This example we have here is Blooming Ladies Cooperative based in, I believe, Edmonton. And the members of this cooperative are women artisans and women-led small businesses from immigrant backgrounds. And the need they had was to connect with customers, get good prices for their products and services, and work in a supportive community. And so how they did this is they came together and they collectively created an online marketplace platform to share the costs of online marketing and sales management. So they all have their different companies and they have this shared online platform where they're able to share the costs of promoting and selling their work. And this is a very common form of producer co-op, is finding a way to collectively market, share the costs of getting your name out there and getting your products distributed. Let me take a quick sip of water. Okay, the next example is a very cool one. This is the Erin Theatre, which is a consumer cooperative based in Campbellford, Ontario. And the theater has been open since 1947 and was run as a business, but then it was at risk of being sold and torn down. And so in 2010, the cooperative incorporated and the community was able to collectively purchase this theater. So in this case, the members are individuals and families who want to see movies and events in the theater in their own town, in their own community. And so the need was to maintain this actually also primarily Indigenous led cultural hub within the community that showcases art, film, and culture. So there's a really important cultural piece here, community ownership piece. And so they were able to come together, purchase the theater, keep it in the community. Something to note also is this is a consumer co-op. It's also not for profit because the purpose is not to make money, but to really like preserve this cultural asset and provide opportunity for art and expression and engagement with that in their community. Our next example is WIN Cooperative, which is a social or community service co-op. And this is where I want to highlight that the structure, trying to categorize everything in a particular structure, it won't always work because in the case of a community service co-op, it really highlights that it's a non-for-profit co-op serving the community in the way that a non-for-profit would. But that doesn't define the membership. So you may have a community service co-op that is also a consumer co-op like the Erin Theatre. Just note that there might be multiple terms that apply. Anywho, the community service cooperative, in this case, WIN, is based in Victoria, BC, and they offer programs that include crisis intervention, financial and other resource support for women, non-binary, two-spirit, and trans individuals in the community. And so that's who the members are. So it's these folks from these different identity groups and the volunteers who work and volunteer their time with the organization as well. And the community need they're serving is access to programs that support the journey from crisis intervention to self-sufficiency. And so wherever folks may be, whether they have just experienced some kind of crisis or are in crisis, whether they're working their way towards self-sufficiency, WIN provides various types of development programs, support programs, job experience, these types of different things to help these individuals be able to be self-sufficient and autonomous. Next, we have CULSA Credit Union, or the credit union as a structure. Essentially, a credit union is a financial consumer cooperative. It's the people who are accessing the services of the credit union that are the members. They're called credit unions because the credit union movement is very tied to the labor union movement. Often labor unions were what am I trying to say? Often labor unions created credit unions. And so even though they're cooperatives, they're called credit unions, just so you know. But financial consumer cooperative is also true, less catchy. And the members, as I just mentioned, are banking and financing clients. Their need is to access affordable, in this case with CULSA Credit Union, it's a Sikh-owned credit union. And so the need here is beyond just accessing affordable banking services. They also want ones that are culturally appropriate, access to financing options, loans, and control over decision making. We also have housing cooperatives, which are homes that are collectively owned. In this example, we have the Ansar Community Housing Cooperative, which is located in Scarborough, Ontario. And this one is really interesting because it's a housing co-op specific to Muslim families and individuals. And their need was stable, affordable housing that's accessible, which is generally the need in housing co-ops. And also, again, this culturally appropriate piece around financing that's aligned with Muslim practices, one of which is no interest. So finding solutions to be able to access homes that are affordable and also that align with your own belief system. Very cool. Um, that was the last piece around structure. That's what's really going to help guide you in your handbook activity or handout activity. And so feel free to return to that part. There's some notes in the handout as well that will help guide and remind you of what we talked about here. But feel free to return and look at those structures again and do some more research. And some more complex structures, I think, that we would love to talk about here are the investment cooperative, which are cooperatives where groups of people come together because they want to pool their resources in order to invest in community initiatives. And so the two examples we have here are similar but different. Glen Valley Organic Farm is a co-op that supports securing farmland in the Fraser Valley in the Lower Mainland and near Vancouver so that it can be preserved for organic farming as opposed to sort of sold for development. And so their portfolio is very specific. It's geographically specific, and they also fund a specific industry or sector. And then the other example is the East Kootenay Community Investment Cooperative, and they will invest in all sorts of different community initiatives, but specifically in the East Kootenay region. So you can see how there's different, you can have different specificity in your investment co-op. Usually they are regionally specific because they're trying to support a particular community. Next, we have what are called second tier cooperatives. And I actually should have included BCCA's logo here too, because we are a second tier co-op. And what these are is co-ops of co-ops. So in the case of BCCA, we are a cooperative of the cooperatives of BC. So our members are other cooperatives. So you can see there's like a second tier. And in the case of Co-op, which is a logo you may recognize, this red co-op logo, they are basically a producer co-op of consumer co-ops. So there's gas stations and grocery stores that are all with this red co-op logo, and all those individual co-ops are members of this unified brand of co-op. And the other example we have here is Arctic Cooperatives Limited, which is a very cool organization that is a second tier co-op whose members are all consumer cooperatives of the northern regions of the provinces and the territories, which all have very specific needs in terms of procurement and getting supplies and important goods as affordably as possible to very remote communities. That's a very cool one to look into. Then we also have, there's even a level beyond that. We have the third tier cooperative, and the logo here you may recognize is the Cooperators Insurance. And they operate across Canada, and we sort of say they're owned by the cooperative sector. They're a co-op of co-ops of co-ops. Their governance structure is kind of complicated for this reason. You can totally do some more research on it, but just know that they're sort of a tier above the second tier. And finally, we have also what's called the multi-stakeholder cooperative. So this could potentially be better termed as like multi-shareholder or multi-member. And what it essentially means is you have a cooperative with different types of membership involved. So you might have a worker and consumer cooperative, for example. That is the case with Central Co-op. This example in the middle, it is a grocery store where the consumers, the people buying the groceries, as well as the employees of the store are all owners. In the case of Stocksy, they have that structure as well with worker and consumer owner. They are a stock image site, so you can go, like Getty Images or Shutterstock, where you go in and you can purchase stock photos or images. And in the case of Stocksy, they have a lot of different members. They have, I believe, the artists who contribute the images, the consumers, and the workers. So 3 different types of membership. And I'll give the last example as well and give some context. Cop Apps on the far right hand side is actually based in Italy, and it's a very, very cool cooperative. I think it is such an exciting example of how a multi stakeholder co-op can be applied. But essentially, they are a cooperative that supports individuals with disabilities. And so they provide programming and different development support. And the members of this co-op are the families of the participants and the social workers. And so what you have is you have the people providing care and the people seeking care collectively deciding how to best serve their community. And that to me makes so much sense, is so wonderful. Could be a great application for elder care as well. And so as you can see, there's ways you can sort of complicate this model and add different layers depending on the communities you're trying to serve and who you really need to be involved in the decision making. Something important to note about multi-stakeholder cooperatives is they can be very challenging because you have different people from different interest groups represented. And so what's cool is that means that certain discussions get hashed out in the boardroom that might not otherwise. But what can be a challenge is that it might be harder to make decisions because you're trying to balance multiple needs at once, which maybe is really important to do and um, maybe makes things very complicated. Some other co-op examples that are kind of fun to look at that I love to share because they are often very surprising and striking, and a good reminder that cooperatives are not necessarily tiny grassroots organizations. Often they are, but they can also be very large and very successful on a grand scale. Things like sports teams like the Green Bay Packers or the Saskatchewan Roughriders or Barcelona FC. In fact, most of the Spanish league soccer teams are cooperatively owned by the fans. We also have food companies like Ocean Spray, Tillamook Cheese, Sunkist, Blue Diamond Almonds. And we also have things like Home Hardware and PharmaSave. So, and hotels, Best Western, accountants, KPMG. There's so many large cooperatives, particularly often outside of North America, but in North America as well, as evidenced by a number of these. So some surprises that you may not have known about. All right, we're nearing the end now. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this. In sort of the closing of this presentation, I really just want to highlight again this piece I mentioned earlier around the global aspect of this movement and how international it is and far-reaching across the world. As I mentioned, there's 3 million cooperatives globally, and at least 1 billion people belong to at least one co-op. In Canada, I believe there's almost 8,000 cooperatives, and at least half of people are involved. So it's really quite a substantial movement, and whether people know it or not, they are often involved. And this piece here, I want to highlight that international aspect and also how it's all very interconnected, even when it's got such a global scale. So on the ground level, we have our individual cooperatives, the people, working in their communities. And then on the second layer, we have the second tier cooperatives, the association. So the example here I have is the BC Cooperative Association, but it could be the Ontario Cooperative Association, the New Brunswick Cooperative Council. Wherever you're located, there's that provincial level support. And then beyond that, there's even a Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, the Canadian version of us. So they support, the movement broadly across the nation. And then again, we have the International Cooperative Alliance, who I mentioned earlier, the ones who, set out the values, the principles, and make sure they're up to date and really provide a platform for the movement on an international scale. So there's really these levels of support, and that comes back to principle number 6, cooperation among cooperatives. We've got all these different levels of support to really help the movement globally. And finally, if you were to just have like 5 key takeaways from this presentation about summarizing cooperatives, I would like to lay some out for you that you could hold on to in addition to whatever else you may have found really exciting and interesting. The first is that co-ops are found across industries, across sectors. They're really adaptable in structure, so they're able to operate in all these different places and contexts. They are democratic and autonomous. They are in service of their communities and members. And because of this, they are dependent on engaged members. And you'll come to see more about this as you move into the next modules around governance and member engagement and beyond. That brings us to the end. Thank you so much again for joining me for this Cooperatives 101. I hope it was very informative, and I hope you enjoy the handout, and I look forward to discussing and hopefully connecting with you further about cooperatives in the future. Thank you very much.